This is the Sports Business Classroom audio experience with Cory Jez. Welcome to episode 2 of the series featuring Cory Jez. If you're a Trailblazers fan, you're probably familiar with Cory's work. He spent last season as the analytics insider on the Blazers TV broadcasts. In fact, Cory was the first and only full-time analytics broadcaster in the NBA. We probably should have more of them. Prior to that role, Cory spent 4 years as head of analytics for the Utah Jazz. He also worked in soccer for Austin FC in the MLS. He's consulted for a number of teams in soccer, baseball, and basketball. Oh, and his father was a college basketball coach. So yeah, he's not just a numbers guy. He grew up in the game. In this episode, Cory and I will discuss his role with the Trailblazers broadcast, the importance of educating fans on advanced metrics. We'll touch on tracking stats and how they inform some of our current debates. We'll dive into the alphabet soup of the all-in-one metrics, learns which ones we should actually use. And if you missed episode 1 with Kevin Pelton, you can, of course, find that in this same feed. You don't need to listen in order necessarily, but we did cover some of the basics in episode 1. So if you're new to all this, might be helpful to go get that overview first. Hey everyone, I am Howard Beck, and I will be your host for the next 4 episodes of this podcast as we delve into basketball analytics, the whys and hows, the do's and the don'ts, with a series of experts who, frankly, know way more than I do on the subject. I guarantee you I will be learning as much as you will be, and frankly, that was part of my goal in devising this series. You see, I've been covering the NBA as a journalist for 26 years, and a lot has changed in that time. The way the game is played, the way it's covered, the way we analyze it and discuss it. And when it comes to statistics, that discussion has changed dramatically, even just over the last 5 to 10 years. The tools we use, the terminology, the vast amount of data that's available now. Our conversations about the game are smarter now because of it all, but, well, it can be enough to make your head spin too. I've done my best as a reporter to learn as much as I can, but I still get tripped up at times, and I've often thought, why isn't there a course we can all take, fans and media alike, to learn how to best use all these new stats? My friends at the Sports Business Classroom agreed, and so here we are, a 4-part series to make us all a little smarter with guidance from some of the sharpest people working in basketball analytics. Okay, let's get to it. I am here with Cory Jez. Cory, welcome. You spent this past season as the analytics insider for the Trailblazers, providing fans a lot of insight during the local TV broadcast, which frankly was just a really phenomenal idea. You did a great job with it. I would love to see more teams and the networks, frankly, do the same. I've often thought during this era of advanced stats in the NBA that the hardest part is bringing everyone up to speed, right? The TV commentators, beat writers, our audiences, the fans. And if I'm writing about defensive efficiency 10 or 12 years ago, but the broadcasters are still talking about defensive points per game allowed and ranking teams that way, we're not getting anywhere. I think we've come a little bit of a ways since then, but I feel like it's still the biggest challenge, just getting everyone to speak the same language. So I was really happy to see what you did with the Blazers this past season, getting people to kind of grasp a lot of these stats that maybe are still new to some casual fans. So kudos to you and the Blazers. I want to start there. What was the general goal of these segments in Portland? What were the concepts or ideas that you were most eager to get across in this role?
Well, Howard, thanks first of all for having me on, and always love talking about it. It's finals season, I guess we can call it. Although the Nuggets seem so bored that they're trading picks instead of getting ready for tonight's game. But there was a short-lived television show on HBO. Still one of my favorites, The Newsroom, Aaron Sorkin, for people who saw it. And Will McAvoy's the main character and played by Jeff Daniels. And there's a line in the show where he says, I'm on a mission to civilize. And his boss says to him, how's that going? And he says, progress is slow, but I'm in it for the long haul. And I think I've used that GIF of that scene probably like 1,000 times, either between friends or actually on Twitter when trying to kind of make some inroads in just leveling up the discourse around basketball analytics. Because the fact of the matter is we're all going to use numbers. Charles Barkley, Stephen A. Smith, people who either who are so very well intentioned and very intelligent about the game are going to use numbers by and large on kind of the national scale. Like you said, sometimes national media, national writing, folks who have not necessarily been indoctrinated into that school are just probably going to use the wrong ones when they're talking about the game. And the whole goal, big picture, and I think this feeds into the Portland experience from the last year, is not to beat people over the head with analytics and not to say VORP, warp, schnorp, dorp, all these things. I think Zach Lowe has a version of that he really likes. And
the VORPs and schnorps, he loves it. Yes,
the VORPs and schnorps of the world. So, it's not the goal is actually, I think the goal is the opposite of what fans initially think. They think you're coming in to sterilize the game. They think you're coming in to distill it down to a single number and take the beauty and art away from it. And it's actually the exact opposite. I want to add the context of the beauty and art. I want to help people understand when Damian Lillard makes that shot over Paul George, just how unreal crazy it was contextually, right? We all know it was nuts. But, the average player only makes that shot 2% of the time or whatever it might be, right? And Damian Lillard, even as great as he is, only makes that shot 8% of the time, right? Or whatever the number might be for any particular bucket. And so, credit to kind of the leadership and the decision makers at Portland going back, basically a year now and saying, one, how can we evolve our broadcast in general? And what are the things that are happening in basketball in 2023 that people need to be talking about, or at that time, 2022, that people need to be talking about that they're not right now? And you can't get around the modern discourse of basketball without talking about advanced statistics. And it kind of was the natural parlay. Big shout out to friend of the program, Ben Falk, previously of the Trailblazers and 76ers, the Hinkie era 76ers. There's a really great Sam Hinkie story of when he is, I think it was Allen Iverson's jersey retirement game. And Sam Hinkie, then general manager of the Sixers, instead of being at the game, as most GMs would be for any jersey retirement game, is at a kosher pizzeria in Brooklyn recruiting Ben Falk to come work for the Philadelphia 76ers, which he eventually then does. And Ben has since gone on to be the proprietor of Cleaning the Glass, which I think we'll talk about, or you've probably already talked about with Kevin before on here. And Cleaning the Glass is one of the best publicly available advanced analytics sites for NBA people. So it really is just about leveling up that discourse. And Ben is the one, to bring that full circle, who made the connection since he was a previous Blazers employee and a close friend of mine and mentor of mine as well, who made that connection into being able to do that last season with the Blazers. And so it was a ton of fun. It was so brand new for me and so out of my depth, and continue to be out of my depth when it comes to doing live television, which is maybe the scariest thing I've ever done for sure. Especially I did a majority of them. We kind of created a little studio in my house as I live in Austin, Texas. Obviously did about probably 24 games home and on the road with the team as well, but pretty scary, and you're talking, especially I don't have kind of the whole environment of an arena and what's going on and trying to match the energy and have the right level of energy and all those types of things. So awesome experience. But again, the whole goal was really to add the level of discourse into the zeitgeist for Portland fans. The same type of stuff that Chauncey Billups and Joe Cronin are looking at, right? When a team gets ready to play an opponent, they're looking at second spectrum and pick and rolls and, which side of the floor do they run that action on? And do they do it with an empty corner? They do it, what happens when you blitz it? Do they pass out? Does the guy slide up? Whatever the action, whatever the basketball action, that the X's and O's thing we could go into, just trying to put numbers to that and quantify it, right? And so in a pregame show or at halftime or a timeout, we want to talk about the same stuff and add that same level of discourse, level of context. So the fans, because they're, Portland, like many markets, is, super heavily invested in their team and are really intelligent. I mean, the Pacific Northwest is a hotbed for basketball at pretty much every single level. And they're crazy for it up there. So it's just adding a layer into that discourse for them.
Yeah. And important to note, as you just alluded to, the things that you were explaining on those broadcasts are the same things that the coaches and the front office staff are themselves citing, because they are discussing this at a deeper level than what is normally discussed among fans or on a lot of broadcasts, frankly. I was going to ask about some of the segments you did, but I actually thought we have a much more current or recent and vivid example. And people who are listening now, by the time you hear this, the finals may well be over. But Cory has kind of tipped our hand as to when this is being recorded. So I'm going to just jump off of something that we just saw in the context of the NBA Finals debate, because I think it gives us a nice discussion point here, which is that there is a difference sometimes, not only between the raw box score stats and the more fleshed out advanced stats or tracking stats, which we now have available to us, but that the eye test, sometimes the vaunted eye test, can even be faulty. And the case in point was Stephen A. Smith and JJ Redick's recent debate on ESPN. Stephen A. asserting, if folks missed it, that Nikola Jokic was not a great post scorer, which was probably not an uncommon opinion in his defense, because it's not the most prominent aspect of Jokic's game. I mean, at a glance, the eye test, we might not think it's a strength in the same way that we thought of it, say, with regard to Shaquille O'Neal or Hakeem Olajuwon. But JJ Redick, being a very stat-minded former player and analyst now himself, had the data and came back with it immediately. And he noted that the most efficient half-court play in the entire NBA over the last 10 years was a Nikola Jokic post-up. And Stephen A., upon that revelation, promptly imploded, and the broadcast ended. No, that's not what happened. And I don't want to pick on Stephen A. because, I don't think that would probably be that uncommon of a perception. Cory, what's the lesson of that exchange?
Well, I think the lesson is probably twofold. Is that one, we as humans, we really are pattern recognition machines. That's what our brains are always trying to do. They are trying to recognize patterns. I know if a car is going this fast down the street that I can make the light or not, right? Like I've recognized the pattern, that I understand how far away. Nobody does math in their head when they're crossing the street, whether driving, whatever the scenario, to say, is the meters per second, am I going to survive if I cross the street at this time? We have recognized the pattern to allow us to cross the street and be safe, hopefully. Right. And you can think of that to, any sort of scenario in your life. You can probably finish your spouse or some of your best friends' sentences because you recognize the pattern in the ways that they speak. Right. And so our desire in the way our brains work is that we want to logically categorize things. And there's lots of great research. I know, Howard, we were emailing and texting back and forth about books and Thinking Fast and Slow. Daniel Kahneman's kind of the psychologist with some of the best research on this and kind of how our brains want to categorize things. And so with Jokic, and to bring it back to basketball, we want to categorize players into certain types of players, right? And there are some players who fit archetypes beautifully. Lou Williams and Jordan Clarkson are the off the bench, fireball, score at will, maybe not the most efficient in the world, but boy, it's fun to watch kind of player, right? And you can compare them and say they're very similar to one another, right? Rudy Gobert is a back to the basket, rim rolling, defensive center who has, very little offensive perimeter game and really doesn't want to play with the ball in his hands and wants to be dunking it as soon as he gets it, right? And there's other very common archetypes to that, whether it's Jared Allen or kind of choose your player there. So Nikola Jokic, we put him in this basket in our mind. And even if you were modeling or using math to try to put him in a basket to categorize players, which is a statistical process that a lot of teams undertake in sort of, player clustering is what it would be called, trying to say, what type of player are you? He's going to grade out as like a perimeter big. He's going to grade out closer to someone like Miles Turner than he does Rudy Gobert probably. And Joel Embiid's probably somewhere in the middle, right? Because Joel's got more of a, post game. It seems like a more common thing that Joel Embiid does than Nikola Jokic. But to your point, Jokic does a lot of things, and Jokic kind of breaks the mold in a lot of ways, and he doesn't necessarily fit cleanly into one bucket or another. He's got some Brook Lopez. He's got more Brook Lopez to his game than Rudy Gobert does, right? So we don't think about him the same way we think about Shaq or Rudy Gobert. And yet he also does this other thing really well. Maybe he does it a few times less per game. Certainly does it less than Shaq did back in the day. And certainly probably, I don't have it in front of me, but he probably posts up less frequently than Joel Embiid does. I'd feel pretty confident saying that. And so he does not come to mind to Stephen A. Smith or to probably most basketball observers, like you said, Howard, as a back to the basket, punish you kind of guy. Which, by the way, for folks who maybe haven't paid attention to this before, when he gets the ball in the post tonight, tomorrow night, I don't even know what day of the week it is, but tonight.
Tonight, but as far as the listeners are concerned, a week ago.
Yeah, actually watch it. He punishes dudes down there. Like he has mass. It's the slightly different, body mass index than Joel Embiid, but he has a lot of mass to throw around, and he is actually very punishing in the post. And it's why, back to the original point, is the most efficient half court play in the tracking era, as long as you kind of remove small sample. And just to give folks the numbers to it, he has had post actions 4,795 times in the tracking era, which would essentially be his entire career. And those are good for 1.11 points per possession. So, which would be a 111 offensive rating, league average, kind of the benchmark for half court offenses, somewhere around 100 to 105. And those are changing and evolving over time. And depending on which team you're talking about, could be a little different. So somewhere between 5 and 10% more efficient than the average NBA half court possession is a Jokic post up. And it happened, and again, it happens quite frequently as well. So I think the takeaway there is actually recognizing what might be a gap in kind of our, cognitive perception of things and saying, wow, Jokic really doesn't feel like a post-up kind of guy because he's not Shaq, he's not Embiid, he's not, whoever. But that doesn't mean he can't do the thing. And I think the second lesson there is that JJ Redick, part of the reason why I think he's been so great, as a broadcaster and as kind of an analyst is because he reminds me a lot of, Shane Battier, who feels like they have a very similar view of the world and view of the game, in that they understand what is measurable and what is available to them as resources to ask and answer these questions. And they can provide obviously the basketball context because they have, an elite basketball IQ, both guys like that, but also bring to the table, hey, this is actually like a thing we can kind of know the answer to. Right. And that's evolved over time, too, as new data has become available, as the way we define things has become available, because the distinction I think is really important to make is that data is not the ultimate arbiter of right or wrong or correct or incorrect. Or, you mentioned like, does this ultimately settle the bar stool, the debate you'd have sitting on a bar stool with someone. And all data is information from a framework that we created by which to capture our perception of what's reality of what's happening. Like second spectrum cameras and a scorekeeper on the sideline and the box score and all those things. Like if we think about reality in the very true sense of the word, not to get like overly, philosophical here, but just because we capture and count things a certain way doesn't mean that it's any more or less real than another way somebody else, a different framework by which somebody else might choose to capture or analyze or think about something. That's just the peg in the hole that we've built to measure this thing. In this case, we're talking about basketball, right? But that could be true for anything. Good and bad are very ephemeral concepts that, we're just putting numbers to things in a certain way. And so I think it's understanding what that framework is and saying there also are gaps in those frameworks, right? And we'll talk about some other metrics that there could be gaps in those metrics and things that just because a metric says a player is good is not the ultimate arbiter in the it's saying exactly what it's saying, but it's also not saying what it's not. So kind of roundabout way of saying like, that's how we're measuring it. And it's as close as we think we can to measure reality, but it's still a human's kind of perception of things as well.
So after that exchange between Redick and Stephen A., you retweeted that clip on Twitter. And then you attached a table, which actually showed, and I'll repeat just the top 5 here for context. So Jokic's post-ups, number 1 half-court efficiency. Again, this was, I think, like a 10-year sample, which was followed by a James Harden isolation, a Kevin Durant isolation, a Luka Doncic pick and roll, and Steph Curry pick and roll. So that was the top 5. That gives you some of the context for just how dominant or efficient a Nikola Jokic post-up was compared to these other elite play types of these other elite players. For the newcomers to advanced stats and where to find things like this, where did that table come from? Where does that data come from? How reliable is it? And is that in fact the best way to win the barstool / water cooler / barbershop debate?
Yeah. So I think it's important to take a step back and talk about like what data is in the context of the NBA, and what information we have available to try to do these analyses. Because again, this is supporting information to help us draw a conclusion. This is the number in and of itself is not the conclusion. No general manager in the NBA is going to be like, the number says this, and so this is the case, and we're not going to discuss it any further at any other context. Like, that's not how evaluation works, right? We still are going to add context. Now, I will add some context to the Jokic number here in a second. But so there's kind of three levels of data. There's the box score. Been around since basically the 50s, for all intents and purposes, since we put a peach basket on top of a telephone pole. And the box score is there not because it is the most important thing, but it is because it is the easiest things to count. Points, assists, rebounds, steals, blocks, turnovers, and turnovers didn't come until much later anyways, fouls, etc. And the box score is still, you can still glean a lot of information from the box score. I know you've talked about the 4 factors with Kevin Pelton. You can still generate those just based on box score data. It is a good starting point. The second layer down, as we get into kind of through the topsoil and into the upper crust of basketball analytics, would be event level data. So this is a data set that in the NBA and generally in college you have now. And that is what scorekeepers on the sidelines are manually putting together. So Nikola Jokic shoots from 6 feet from the basket and is defended by Jimmy Butler and misses. And there was, there was a potential assist from Jamal Murray, and it happened at this time on the clock, and it happened at this location on the floor. So you have that for each possession terminating action. So you're not getting that for every pass, but you're getting that for every shot, every turnover, every rebound, steal, assists. If there's an assist associated with a shot or potential assist associated with a shot, substitution, inbounds, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, things that start in possessions is what you're getting there, and that's a really rich data set. And you're getting hundreds, if not thousands, of events in a given game. Now, what that doesn't capture is, well, maybe Curry makes an Iverson cut across, the front of the paint and takes 2 defenders with him, and that clears things up for Jordan Poole to have an easy drive to the basket, right? And in that situation, hypothetical, Steph Curry creates a ton of value by cutting across the lane and opening it up for Jordan Poole to get to the basket. And in the data set I just described, all that's going to be represented is Jordan Poole made layup 2 points, and you'll have no representation of that value. So the third layer, and this is pretty much the Earth's magma of basketball data sets, is what we call spatiotemporal tracking data, and provided by a company called Second Spectrum, who's the provider, who is the league's official tracking provider, who we also partnered with in Portland last year. And this is 10 cameras in every NBA arena, and they even have portable units when we go to Mexico City and France and things like that. But 10 cameras in every NBA arena that are capturing video of the game. A layer of computer vision algorithms on top of that turn the video of players into dots that move around the floor 25 times a second, including the ball in 3 dimensions and all the players in 2 dimensions. So if people have maybe seen this before, but you can see the dots running around the floor as the game unfolds, similar thing in soccer. And that's basically the tracking data set. Now, dots in and of themselves, not particularly useful. We want to know, did you switch the pick and roll, right? And so what we can do with the third layer of algorithms is actually say, okay, dots, I'm looking at all the dots and I know those are pick and rolls and I know those are switches. And this is what we call machine learning, because we've taught the machine to learn what a pick and roll looks like and what a switch looks like. Like 15 years ago, they went and sat with the Boston Celtics video staff and said, give us 100 videos of ice, give us 100 videos of center field drop, give us 100 videos of switch, give us 100 videos of high edge. And they took the dots and they taught the dots like, hey, that's what that is. And they refined that process over time. That's machine learning. And Now you have basically every conceivable basketball action. So that Iverson cut across the face of the paint, and you've got that quantified in a way as an actual discretized thing that I can ask a question about and quantify. And a post up is a perfect example of that. Post up is something that would not show up in any of these other, obviously in the box score or even in the event level data set. And so this is what really tells us that adds a huge layer of context to all of these things. So now if I know the location of everybody and the ball at every shot, I can know things like how long did the player have the ball in his hands? How close was the nearest contest? Was the guy who's contesting flying towards you or standing still? Because you'd be 3 feet away, but very different versions of 3 feet at a snapshot in time. All these different types of things. And so that's what we call colloquially tracking data. And tracking data is what drives a lot of these things, like JJ Redick's number that he brought up with Stephen A on GetUp. And it is not, so what I tweeted out is not something that's publicly available. That's directly from Second Spectrum System, which internal teams have access to, and they're sure as hell not going to be tweeting out their versions of it. But from a broadcasting standpoint, we also again had our own partnership deal, could tap into that data, used it a ton in Blazers broadcasts last season as well. But what the NBA does do, and I haven't gone and tried to replicate that exact number on NBA.com, but on NBA.com they surface a lot of this information for fans. Pretty user intuitive, pretty friendly tool to use, where you can look at like a shot dashboard and say, how does a guy shoot when he's got a defender within 2 feet, or how does a guy shoot when he has a defender more than 6 feet away from him, which would be considered wide open, and things like that you can look up. I'm pretty sure you can look up post ups and other types of actions as well. And so those are resources that are there. I mean, they are out there waiting to be used. They're probably, more of a reference tool that it's hard to do kind of hardcore analysis with that. You really need the raw data and some of these more advanced tools, or actually your own database, which is what every team is doing. So the teams internally are not using NBA.com or even Second Spectrum's website. They're pulling all of that stuff into their own database so that they can ask a question like, when Steph Curry goes right out of the pick and roll against drop coverage, how often does he get to the hoop and finish over a contest? Or how often does he kick to the near side corner or the weak side corner, or things like that, that you can't really answer in an out of the box solution. So it's the more advanced team side of things. So that's kind of 101 about, both to answer your question, Howard, of where fans can access a question like that when they hear Stephen A and JJ. So you can go to NBA.com and get a lot of those things, but also kind of the broader picture of stats and what's available in kind of the basketball NBA universe.
So we've got NBA.com/stats if people want to go there. And then there's a drop down menu for player tracking. And there's a number of things you can see there, including things like, potential assists and the secondary, like hockey type assist, things that we never could quantify in a pre-tracking era. Or maybe the teams could. Maybe someone was scribbling it all down or breaking down tape and doing all that by hand. But we certainly, as the public, didn't have it. A lot of that stuff is available now. As Cory mentions, though, of course, Second Spectrum is providing subscription service for bazillions of dollars to these teams. So there's a lot of proprietary stuff that we do not have access to. And the handy dandy graphic that was in Cory's Twitter stream, unfortunately, is only available to you if you look at Cory's Twitter feed. So, but some of this stuff is available at NBA.com/stats. You mentioned also earlier Ben Falk's great site, cleaningtheglass.com. Now, there's also two versions of that. There's a paid subscription version, and then there's a lot of just publicly available stuff there as well. Do you think, like, for the average user or average fan who just doesn't necessarily want to invest a lot of time and money, but they're looking for more info, another layer about their favorite players, their favorite team, or even if it's not there to win the Barstool debate, Cory, I understand the number is not definitive, but it's a good way of dunking on your friends sometimes. Are those the two places you would go? And the NBA.com/stats, cleaning the glass, are those, and give our listeners a little bit of a sense of the kinds of things you can find there that give you a little bit more insight into aspects of the game.
Yeah, there's no shortage of places to find numbers about basketball. Certainly, you can go to Basketball Reference, another great site that has their own search tool that's paid, but a lot of it's free. Cleaning the glass, and the thing that Ben has done so well, and this is because of his professional background and experience, is there is no shortage of numbers. Like, the issue that we face today is not, we don't have enough numbers. We got plenty of VORPs and SHNORPs, right? The issue is, what are the right contextual ones to look at? When I want to say, hey, who's a better scorer? Well, maybe points per shot attempt is better than points per game, right? And points per shot, essentially saying every time you shoot the ball, or every 100 times you shoot the ball, including the times you get fouled, how many points do you get? Because, of course, of course, Steph Curry is going to take more shots than Desmond Bane, but I honestly don't know who has. I'm sure Steph's efficiency is still probably higher, but maybe Zach LaVine's going to take more shots than Desmond Bane. This might be a better comparison. Or DeMar DeRozan even going to definitely take more than Desmond Bane. But on a per shot basis, who is more efficient? And I don't know that answer off the top of my head, but that you take that away from points per game and you move that into points per shot attempt, which is Ben's metric for shooting efficiency on cleaning the glass. And it's going to give you're actually answering the question you're trying to answer, which is, given the opportunities that they have, who is more efficient, right? Who is the better scorer? Now, look, generating shots is a skill as well. And so there's an added context to that debate of, well, there's probably a reason that Desmond Bane only takes 9 field goal attempts per game to DeRozan's 18, let's say, or per 36 minutes that they even play on the floor. And if you're better at creating shots, you're going to take more shots. And, that's why Durant takes more shots than, choose your role player than DeAnthony Melton, right? And so, there's an added context there. And this kind of comes back to words matter. Something that Seth Partnow talks about a lot, and kind of the nomenclature and the language that we use to describe these things. Like, who's a better scorer? Well, that can mean a ton of things, right? Like, who's going to win a 3-point contest? We've talked about like Curry versus Bird in this context. That gets a lot of national narrative sometimes. Who's the better shooter, right? And, is it who's going to win a 3-point contest, or who can run around the floor and come off of an off-ball screen and shoot on the move with a dude, with an elite defender trailing on their hip, or who can go get you a bucket in a one-on-one situation last minute of the game with Paul George, like prime Paul George defending them, versus straight up who, like, you need someone to hit an open 3 to save your life. Who do you want? And I think the answer to those questions are all 3 different players probably, but they're all different versions of scoring. And it depends on the question that we're asking, what we're trying to actually answer. And that should probably drive the metric that we use to substantiate our argument. Again, this is not to definitively answer something, but each of those different kind of slight variations on scoring would probably be a different metric as well. And again, with things like tracking data, we can say, who is the best wide open shooter in the NBA? And actually, this was a really interesting one to me. At the start of last season, as two years ago, Anthony Simons got a lot of run for Portland once Dame was shut down due to his abdominal injury and surgery that he had about a year and a half ago now. Dame got a ton of run in the second half of the season, and his catch and shoot numbers were off the chart. He was like 46% catch and shoot threes. So when he received the ball from a pass and then shot within 2 seconds or something like that. But he was second in the league in field goal percentage. And I could not believe that it was Zach LaVine that was first. And we all know that Zach LaVine's come a long way as a shooter, but you don't immediately, Zach LaVine does not jump to your head as, it's going to be Klay Thompson or, George Niang, choose your kind of stand in the corner and bang threes guy, right? And I think playing next to DeRozan has done wonders, obviously, for LaVine's career. But, in that context matters. And that question that we answered there with, that Simons LaVine thing, they're obviously super different scorers, right? But it's depending on what are we really trying to say. And this is where, if you bring it back to what a front office is doing, whether they're evaluating players for a trade or free agency or coaching staffs to get ready for another game, those are all very different questions. And we had probably internally, when I worked in a front office, like 4 different metrics for shooting. and definitely multiple different metrics. Nobody just looks at 3-point percentage. Like, absolutely not. They're going to look at catch and shoot off the dribble. They're going to look at on the move, standing still. They're going to look at how close a defender is. They're going to look at all those versions of it. And then they're going to rank you among your positional counterparts, guys who play the same position as you and roughly have the same role as you at that specific skill. Because what we're really trying to quantify is that type of skill. Because if you're the Utah Jazz from 4 years ago looking for a complementary piece for Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, it's like, well, you're probably going to get a lot of standstill corner threes, right? But you're not going to be taking a ton of Dame Lillard style off the dribble threes because Don's going to have the ball in his hands. And so those types of skills, we can actually break them out and quantify them, especially as teams, like I said, get into that tracking data and can cut it up the way they want to.
Well, so Cory, this is a great point, and it leads me to this question, which is that I think we as fans and media, people who are on the outside, we will look at the abstract of a team and say, you know what, Team X needs more shooting, right? They rank among the bottom of the league in terms of 3-point makes per game, or maybe they 3-point makes and even 3-point percentage. That team needs more shooting. They need more spacing. They need more guys around their stars to space the floor. And so the seeming conclusion would be, look at the free agents that summer. Who shoots the highest 3-point percentage? If we could just plug that guy into that team, problem solved. And I'm guessing that the discussion in a front office of which you have been part is probably very different than that. Can you give us an illustrative example of how there's a difference in the way we might talk about this as fans and media versus the way a team assesses the same basic issue?
Yeah, and that's what you just described, Howard, is definitely the starting point. You know, I think back to the Utah Jazz. We lost a series to the Houston Rockets, and you know, Ricky Rubio is still one of my favorite players in the NBA, but he airballs a standstill corner three late in Game 5 of that series, and you just kind of collectively can hear like that's probably his last time as a Utah Jazz player, because you can't have, you know, him and Derek Favors and Rudy Gobert on the floor together, three essentially non-shooting players on the floor in 2018-19 doesn't really fly anymore. And so you're looking, what you just described is definitely kind of the tip of the iceberg, right? We definitely need more shooting. Now we need to put that into context, because look, that guy's still got to play defense, right? And you end up with someone like a Bojan Bogdanovic in that role instead of Derek Favors, or maybe instead of Jay Crowder going forward, right? And there is a lot of context to how your shots get created and how generally your offense gets created. And what I think the Levine DeRozan thing is a really good example of this. And I always I've described Zach LaVine as someone, he's kind of an inflection point player for me, where he's just good enough to create for himself, but he's probably not the player to be the sole creator out of the five guys on the floor for like a championship caliber team, right? He's like he's a really good 1B basically. And, you know, different stages and levels of his career and different contexts of teams. And if Lonzo Ball's healthy in Chicago, that all changes a little bit, right? But all of a sudden Kyle Kuzma is another great example of this, right? Like all of a sudden you put Kyle Kuzma next to Bradley Beal, you put Zach LaVine next to DeMar DeRozan, and you put Aaron Gordon next to Jokic and Jamal Murray, right? You think about Aaron Gordon was supposed to be when he was number 4 pick in the draft, I think, you know, and what he was supposed to be in Orlando. And now he's thriving, like absolutely in the perfect role. Obviously, he slowed down a little bit, but he's not going the way of Blake Griffin, mainly because he's not being asked to do nearly as much. And he's in a role where he can play really strong defense. He can play complementary offense. You know, he can attack a closeout, right? He can still hit the open shot when asked to do so. You know, he can play in the dunker spot, you know, and when pull Jokic out and put him down in the young dunker spot or whatever the situation might be. He's very versatile on offense. Not great necessarily at any one of those things, but very versatile. And all those are examples of context-driven situations for players, right? And that's what a team is going to be evaluating and saying, well, if you have Rudy Gobert and Derek Favors on the floor, adding, even though it's great to maybe have a distribution first point guard like a Ricky Rubio next to Donovan Mitchell, because now Ricky can help create advantage situations for Donovan. Boy, what's that do to your floor spacing, and what does that do to things? And obviously, over time, Utah kind of steered in the other direction and became one of the best 3-point shooting teams in the league under Quinn Snyder as well, most frequent. And so that's the type of context that teams are going to be looking at, relative to the players we have. We generally speaking, this is kind of like the change of scenery effect that people will talk about when a trade happens. Maybe it's like, a little bit of change of scenery for both the guys, and maybe that works out. And I think what's actually happening under the hood when you talk about change of scenery effect is guys end up in a situation that's just slightly better kind of complementary context to their games. And that's really what allows them to thrive. So that's how teams are going to be thinking about it. And again, as an analytics department or as a practitioner within a team, you're going to be trying to support those things and trying to say, put a number to those types of situations. And, you might be able to say our offense with, point guard A and center B generates these types of shots for our three other players who are the best people in the league at those types of shots, whether they are attack to closeouts, whether they're catch and shoot threes, whether they're threes on the move, whether they're offensive rebound opportunities, whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's funny because it does point up the Aaron Gordon example, and I've cited this myself, that it's not necessarily just the quote unquote change of scenery, right? It's context. It's who you're playing with and the role you're being asked to play, and sometimes it's simply a matter of playing the role that's best suited for you, which is what we've seen now with the Denver Nuggets version of Aaron Gordon versus the Orlando Magic version of Aaron Gordon. And even though probably his athleticism has waned along the way by some percentage, he's a better overall player now in Denver. And it's not because he's added a lot of things, even though he's probably become a better shooter over time, and he's probably just become a smarter player over time. But really more, it's about the fact that you're in an environment where your best skills can be maximized, and you're not also being relied on to be, the leading scorer every night or the core foundational piece. So I always find that interesting. I want to finish with this discussion, one that we could probably have dominate the entire, not just this entire hour of this pod or 3 hours of this pod or this entire series, but we'll try to do it in as brief a manner as possible. But the all-in-one metrics, the alphabet soup, the Vorps and Schnorps. We have PER, John Hollinger's creation from long ago, that kind of got us all started, at least in the public sphere, in these all-in-one numbers and trying to compare players by combining a lot of different things. PER, win shares, box plus minus, real plus minus, regularized adjusted plus minus, estimated plus minus, 72 other plus minuses of some sort, and then all of these cleverly named acronyms that I don't know what they stand for, but there's one that's just all caps LeBron and all caps Darko, all caps Raptor, all caps Carmelo, and they all stand for something, and I don't know what any of them stand for, but they all produce all-in-one numbers, and then you can sort players by them. We do not have time, of course, to discuss and break down them all. So for our listeners who are simply trying, I think, to probably get a grasp of what's the most helpful in their day-to-day lives, which of those all-in-one stats do you feel, Cory, are the most reliable, the ones that you personally would trust the most when you were working in the Utah Jazz front office, or when you've just in your other roles around the league? What are you going to cite and say, and I'm fairly confident when I cite this number in this particular stat that what I'm telling you is meaningful?
Yeah, and so I'll give a little bit of background to some of these and how we got to where we are today too, Howard. So if we go back to that discussion of the layers, of Earth's crust of data, the box score was the original. And some of these metrics are originally just box score based. Box plus minus is box score based regressed to mean something else. PER is generally just box score based. And so they had kind of a limited set of ingredients that were available to them. They were literally metrics created before the event level. That second tier of data was really pervasive, and they were certainly created before the tracking data was pervasive. And also the tracking data is not always publicly available, as we've already covered. So a lot of these publicly available metrics don't even have access to, the whole foods with the best ingredients for these recipes, if you will. So, but all of this is again, in our desire to kind of orderly categorize things as humans, it's a perfectly logical exercise to say, I want to put all 450 players in order, 1 to 450, which again, friend of the program, Seth Partnow, will tell you, don't ever rank players unless you just want to get yelled at on Twitter.
Tears. It's all about tears these days. No rankings, just tears.
Tears just cause tears, I think. And so So the endeavor in and of itself, I think, makes sense, right? To try to measure impact or value of players on the game. And honestly, I mean, when you kind of zoom out, I mean, we're talking about, 94-foot court with lines on it and a standard set of rules. It's a hell of a lot easier than the economy or medicine or, some of these other things that we try to quantify. And it's why I'm not an economist, even though it's what my undergrad degree is in, because there are literally, as we see every day, there are literally no rules, and the Fed will just do whatever they want anyway. So, but the origin of this is taking maybe the things in the box score and, man, how do I weight them to come up with the best individual number? And that's what things like box plus minus and PER, kind of the early versions of this do. When we got that event level data set, where we know at every basket, we know who's on the floor and who's not. And we obviously know the outcome of the possession. If it was anywhere from -4 to +4 points, -4 would basically be you don't score, but you turn the ball over and they get a 4-point play down the other end. And 4 would essentially be you get a 4-point play on your end. That's the range of outcomes of a given possession. And so we know all those things that happen. And with enough data, and the way this looks from a data set perspective, you basically have every player in the league lined up and say who was on the floor on the offense and who was on the floor on the defense and what was the result. And if you give a model like that enough data, usually 3 seasons is kind of the standard, but you can do some kind of mathematical chicanery to not require 3 seasons of data. And that will basically say, here's what we estimate the impact of a single player, because we've seen now hundreds and hundreds and thousands of possessions with that player. And we will do our best to take away the impact of teammates and opponents by doing that. When people say regularized, adjusted, plus minus, regularized and adjusted is the statistical methods, and there are forms of linear regression that the people who built these models are undertaking to try to account for teammates and opponents. The regularization is a machine learning statistical concept. That's why it's called RAPM, regularized, adjusted, plus minus. And the plus minus comes from obviously the fact that at each possession, what is the plus minus effect that they're having? Because raw plus minus, if Howard and I are out there on Team USA and we got 3 Team USA guys out there, it's probably pretty safe to say we're not the ones impacting the pluses or minuses that our team incurs on the floor. And so that's kind of the second wave of these things. There's lots of, and most of them in the public sphere are going to be different flavors of that ice cream, essentially. Whether you are talking about RAPM, which is available in places, 538's Raptor, Carmelo, metrics like that. The third layer, and a lot of this happens kind of under the surface where it's happening at teams and not even going to be publicly available, is take that kind of type of model I just described, sprinkle on all the tracking data and sprinkle on lots of kind of other intelligence to help guide the model to those estimates and let the model converge on those estimates a lot quicker and let the model value things that we otherwise can't see in the data. And a great example of this, Alex Caruso is probably still the most underrated player in the NBA writ large. And the best thing you can do as a defender on a given possession is play great defense for 8 seconds. Your guy tries to drive by you. He can't, tries to get off a shot. You're too tight, has to pivot around for a few seconds. Then he passes the ball. That's like legitimately a great out. And everyone on the bench is like, hell yeah, great D. Right. And we see that happen all the time. And we kind of know that it's great defense. It doesn't generate a steal, doesn't generate a block, doesn't generate a turnover necessarily, but he's got to kick it to another, that offensive player's not got to kick it to a suboptimal situation. And there's 6 seconds left on the clock and they put up a contested 18-footer and they don't get a basket, right? But Alex Caruso or Marcus Smart or Mikal Bridges or whoever it is defending that first action doesn't get any credit in a lot of our traditional kind of ways that we count.
It's not in the box score.
It's not in the box score. And it's not in the event level data either, because the event level data says, Cameron Johnson missed an 18-footer. It doesn't say so-and-so, locked you up for 9 seconds. And that's why Cameron Johnson missed an 18-footer. And so the tracking data is what allows teams to quantify situations like that and things like that and bring that into the fold and bake that into their overall estimates of the players. I've seen certain models that actually rate Alex Caruso as the number 1 defensive player in the NBA, because when you do a better job accounting for things like that, we could debate who's the best. We had the Sharon Jackson thing with the cooking the books earlier in the year, which was very funny as well. But so back to your original. So I kind of wanted to give that somewhat long-winded explanation of how all these things work and how we got to where we are within what's in the public sphere. Brian Kabrowski did a great article on Hoops Hype probably about a year-ish ago. And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his last name, but that basically looked at folks in the media, folks in front offices, and folks who kind of create these models and say, of what's publicly available, what is the best reputed and what is the best available. And there's really two that come to mind, and they're the first two that I tend to gravitate towards. And that's estimated plus minus, which is a product of Taylor Snar, whose website is dunksandthrees.com. Taylor happens to be a good friend, also used to work for the Utah Jazz. Great website, super awesome interface. Again, free tier, paid tier for whatever you like. And he basically creates a version of those incorporating the tracking data that's available on NBA.com/stats that you mentioned to previously, Howard, and tries to incorporate some of that into his estimated plus minus metric. And when you go look at it, my favorite part of it is that Damian Lillard had the best offensive season this season. It's something that went massively overlooked in the national narrative because of just how bad the Blazers were as a team. And Dame also sat out the last 15 or so games of the season. Dame's offensive, Dame probably should have been first team All NBA this year. And I'm pretty, I feel like I can back that up with numbers if anybody wants to have a debate on the side about it. So estimated plus minus, really great use of the tracking data to help build those things, the publicly available tracking data. The other one is called Darko. And yes, it's a backronym, but it's created by a guy named Kosta Medvedovsky, who's actually a M&A lawyer by trade, which is the last person you'd expect to build an advanced basketball model. Kosh is obviously a smart dude, and he did something a little different. So he takes a way to account for the time series and to kind of update our opinion every time we see a new game of basketball in a number of metrics, one of which is kind of his all-in-one estimated plus minus number, which he calls DPM, daily plus minus. And that number, and so what's really great on his site, darko.app, is that you can go on there and actually see a player's career evolve over time. And one of my favorite things about that site is if you pull up Shane Battier and Danny Green, they have, statistically speaking, the exact same career arc, which is great because I think there should be a role player wing of the Hall of Fame somewhere that those two guys would be the first two I'd put in it. But Darko does a really good job of handling this idea that when a new season starts, it's not like we should forget everything we've ever known about a player, right? You know, we don't need another 300 possessions to tell us LeBron and Steph Curry are great. It literally uses the number of calendar days that it's seen since something has happened to kind of update its opinion about the player, whether it's their three-point shooting or their overall impact or their offensive. All these metrics, a lot of them will distill also into offensive and defensive impact as well. So Darko and EPM are kind of the two standard bearers, I think, in the public space today. The goal of which, and to kind of bring this all back, the goal of which is to offensively, defensively, or overall estimate the player's impact per 100 possessions. Yeah. So somebody scores 20, a guy who's a 20 point a game player does not have 20 points of impact in a game, right? If you all of a sudden pluck that player out of a game, those points are going to be filled back up by somewhere else. Now, in theory, if that guy's your starter who scores 20 points in a game, the person you're backfilling him with is going to be a little more suboptimal. So those 20 points of value might come with 18 or something like that they get replaced with. So that player might have, and this is a very kind of simple way to think about it, but you take a 20-point player, replace him with an 18-point player, his offensive impact's roughly 2, right? And not just with points, we're trying to add it up in all, because offensive rebounding has a ton of positive impact, or defensive rebounding has a ton of positive impact, or defending someone and not letting them get by you has a lot of positive impact on the defensive side of the ball. So that's the stuff that we're trying to add up and kind of quantify. And so it is not to say this player is better than the other one, and that's the end of the debate. Context is always going to matter. Another great example of this is the Walker Kessler, Paolo Banchero debate from Rookie of the Year. You know, and Andy Larson and Kevin Pelton were the only two voters that voted Walker Kessler Rookie of the Year. And those guys could not be in more different contexts, right? Paolo is essentially running the offense for Orlando this season. Walker Kessler, when he gets the ball, like there's a reason Walker Kessler has the ball in his hands, right? And it's because there was a good reason to pass to him to begin with. Walker Kessler is not the guy trying to break you down and get a bucket with 6 seconds left on the shot clock, right? And so when we add up their overall impacts, now Walker Kessler is going to grade as being a much more impactful player than Paolo Banchero. Even Tari Eason this season graded out as another rookie who was more impactful than Paolo Banchero. But again, massively different context there in Houston. And so you have to take that context into account. You know, no person is going to build a team simply based on the ranking of estimated plus minus or Darko. And it's, you know, not that should be your MVP ballot 1 through 5 straight across, but it's pretty darn close. I mean, these models are generally very good at estimating the value of players. And there's a quote from kind of the guy who Bill James, who started this whole Moneyball revolution in baseball back in the day, and say, look, if there's a metric that 0 out of 5 times you agree with a metric, it's probably not adding a ton of value to the discourse. But if there's a metric that 4 out of 5 times you agree with it, and then 1 out of 5 times it makes you go, man, that's BS, there's probably something to that, right? There's probably something there that it's picking up on that we are not. And this is something I always encouraged, you know, when I was in a team setting or even in the broadcast setting, and say, if there's a scenario where our scouts or our eye test doesn't line up with, you know, a statistical evaluation of a player, that should be a really exciting moment. That should actually be like, there's something else. Like, yeah, Steph Curry's a good shooter. Oh, great, you know, innovative insight there, guys. You know, when we say Zach LaVine is one of the best shooters in the league, that's kind of an interesting statement that you kind of want to unwrap a little bit, right? And so that should actually be the scenario where you really, really want to dig into it, and you really want to figure out what's going on, you know, in whatever context you're having. Obviously, if you're having the barbershop water cooler, share a beer with your buddy, it's all in good fun. But it still can kind of frame the way we have these discussions. And then obviously when you get into things like MVP voting, all NBA team voting, which has real consequences for player bonuses, which has real consequences for team roster construction, right? And like certain guys making third team all NBA and others not making it and things like that. So, you know, it's a really good kind of lighthouse on the shore, I think, kind of a thing to guide you in the right direction, maybe shrink the size of the haystack a little bit, but it's not, you know, nobody who does this for a living, you know, whether they work for a team or whatever context as an analyst, I don't think anybody who actually spends their nights and days doing this says we should paint by numbers and not have any other discussion around it.
Yeah, and I think that to bring this back to, we'll use the rookie of the year discussion as stand-in for this, but if you're trying to, you know, quantify quote unquote value, which is kind of what stats are there for, right? How valuable is this player doing X task, or how valuable are they in the aggregate? You know, what is there a composite number that tells us, well, okay, if EPM and Darko tell us that Walker Kessler had a better overall season, a more impactful season than Paolo Banchero, it tells us something. It may not tell us about which of one of those you want to build your team around, though. And I'll bring it back to this, just because the water cooler discussion would the next layer would be this. You and I are debating this, and you say, but Howard, listen, these two stats, which I think are by far the best, most indicative all-in-one stats that are out there, are both telling me definitively that Walker Kessler is better. I'm going to come back with, as somebody who voted for Paolo Banchero, by the way, yes, but roll. Paolo Banchero had a vast amount of responsibility, and granted, he has other players there who were carrying some load too, Franz Wagner and others. But Paolo Banchero had a responsibility as a primary scorer, playmaker, everything, ball handler. And maybe his efficiency wasn't as high. It was not. But if I'm going to consider what his responsibility was and role was, I'm going to say, in my mind, that made him the better rookie of the year candidate. All granted that, listen, I would prefer better efficiency, better shooting, all of these things. But I have a hard time voting for Walker Kessler given the less burden that he carried. And granted, he carried more at the defensive end. So that's where this debate could then start to spin round and round. So I guess my question for you on this, Cory, is because people are going to use the numbers as a stand-in for other data or as a definitive marker, is it fair to say, listen, you can say all you want, Howard, about Paolo Banchero's responsibilities and this and that and skill set versus Walker Kessler's, but this number is telling me definitively Walker Kessler had the better season, the more impactful season. He should be the rookie of the year. How do you feel about that framing?
I think we can use numbers to do whatever we want to do. And if we want to, torture them enough, they'll say anything you want. Right. I can absolutely use numbers to come up with, a Tari Eason. Like I could give you a thesis, a dissertation talk about why Tari Eason should have been rookie of the year. And I could use numbers to come up with that if I wanted to. And he's probably got zero. I definitely got zero first place votes for that. So, torture them enough, they'll say anything. Here's what I think it actually comes down to. It's, are you wanting confirmation bias? Are you wanting numbers to say, I'm right, Paolo Banchero was the rookie of the year, or I'm right, Walker Kessler is the rookie of the year? Or are you willing to change your mind? And I think all that we want out of these discussions, and I think it's incredibly refreshing when you see someone, especially a person of power, someone in the media. I mean, this is Super Forecasting, which is another one of the books we talked about, Philip Tetlock, incredible book. I could not write. It's like, anybody asked me my number one book, if you want to work in anything analysis, it's Super Forecasting. And they looked at who are the best people who can predict future events, right? This was, I'm sorry, I'm going off the tangent of the book, but whether it's a geopolitical event, whether it's a basketball event, doesn't matter, right? Who will win the 2026 NBA championship? What team will win the 2026 NBA championship? And you pick a question that has to pass something called the clairvoyance test, which means if you're a clairvoyant, you can actually answer the question. Who's the better player does not answer the clairvoyance test. Who will win rookie of the season next year? That's a question that you can actually tangibly answer, right? So with any of those questions, the people who are best at predicting them at the end of the day, based on a statistical measure called the Breyer score, and Ben Falk actually did a version of this previously on Cleaning the Glass with basketball questions. The people who are the best forecasters, and this is geopolitical, this is, choose whatever topic you want across a range of topics where nobody was an expert in any one topic. But the people who are best at predicting changed their mind on average like 4.2 times, or revised or updated their probability of something happening 4.2 times over the course of, call it, a year. Right. And the lesson we should take from that is that we should not be afraid to change our mind in the light of new information. In statistics, this is called Bayesian statistics, where you say, well, I believe that all coins are fair and that heads and tails should come up equally. And if I get 5 heads in a row, am I going to change my mind about that? Probably not. If I got 5 billion heads in a row, should I probably update my belief that the coin is not fair? Probably, right? And a bunch of gray area in between. And so I think, bringing it back to the rookie of the year debate, if we are willing to be open to the discussion of new information, and let's say you'd not watched Kessler or Banchero play all year, and I just gave you usage, which you just talked about, efficiency, defensive impact, choose your metric for that, right? We put 5 metrics, Walker's probably going to win that battle. It's kind of the blind resume test, right? But then maybe we overlay a little context and we go watch some film and we talk about it over a couple of drinks. And as long as you're willing to update your opinion in the face of new information, all the research and evidence suggests that that's how the best decisions are made in a lot of different contexts, right? And you bring this back to, a draft setting. What general manager would you want making up their mind on February 1st about who they're going to draft, right? You'd want them to be willing to update their opinion based on new information, or someone pops off in the middle of the year, right? Whether it's Shaden Sharp gets more opportunity at the end of the year, or something like that, right? And so I think that's the framework by which, yes, we can use numbers. Yes, we can use numbers with context. We should use numbers with context. And as long as we're kind of not so egotistical that we think we know everything, and willing to kind of update our information. Adam Grant's book Think Again is also a really good example of this. Then I think we're going to get to, there's no right or wrong answer, right? But to the conclusion, the right conclusion or the best conclusion with the information we have, as long as we're always willing to change that conclusion when we get new information.
Fair. And I can already hear listeners out there in the world saying, okay, great, Cory, but so who was the rookie of the year?
It's Walker Kessler.
Based on the data.
Based on my total analysis inclusive of the data.
Yes. And I would just say on top of that, as the person who comes from the world of the dreaded narratives, because I am a writer by trade, these are human decisions and these awards are a human construct and these are human debates. And we bring in as much science and data as we all can. But at the end of it all, you're just trying to process it in a way that makes sense to you. And the way it made sense to me was still but Paolo Banchero had a different and more, a heavier role and a lot more responsibilities. And that made me lean that way. For better or worse, we come up with an opinion at the end, not a scientific conclusion when it comes to this stuff.
Yep. No, unfortunately, basketball is not subject to randomized controlled trials, which are the gold standard for, what we're really asking for is what is causality, right? Which of these things is most causal? And we'll leave that to the medical researchers and the biostatisticians out there who do actual important work instead of arguing over rookies of the year.
Nobody's arguing their work on First Take or screaming about it for that matter. I did ask you for some book recommendations because as somebody pointed out to me on Twitter or asked on Twitter in the wake of our first episode with Kevin Pelton, we had mentioned, of course, Basketball on Paper, and we had mentioned the mid-range theory as some kind of essentials for diving deeper. You've already noted a couple of the books that you mentioned in an email to me, but you can list them for the listeners here about if they want to go a little bit further into some of these areas and also kind of tangential to this discussion, but also relevant in a way.
Yeah, none of the books that come to mind are actual basketball books. While there's no shortage of great ones, I have The Mamba Mentality sitting on my desk right in front of me. But Range by David Epstein, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, Super Forecasting by Philip Tetlock, and Think Again by Adam Grant are probably, if I had to come up with my own little version of a mini MBA in analysis, and how you could apply that to, in this case, sports, probably with Super Forecasting being at the top of that list. Those would be the books that are probably the most interesting to me. It's something that, just be willing to change your worldview a little bit in the light of new information, I think is probably the big through current there.
Great advice in any context, for sure. Cory Jez, thanks so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Howard.
Tremendous info from Cory Jez. Really enjoyed that conversation. Hope you did as well. If you're interested in Cory's work, you can check out his website, coryjez.com. That's CORYJEZ.com. You can also follow him on Twitter @JezData. I am also on Twitter @Howard Beck. If you missed episode 1 with ESPN's Kevin Pelton, I'd encourage you to go listen to that conversation as well. We covered quite a bit, and be sure to tune into this feed in the weeks ahead as other experts join me to explore different aspects of basketball analytics. But before we go, a small request for all our listeners. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to our show and leave us a rating and review. Your feedback and support mean the world to us and help us reach more passionate sports enthusiasts like yourself. Also, I want to encourage you to explore the Sports Business Classroom and discover the incredible resources it has to offer. Whether you're looking to enhance your knowledge of the sports industry, develop your skills, or network with industry professionals, SBC is the ultimate destination. To learn more about SBC and its valuable programs, visit sportsbusinessclassroom.com. Thank you for being a part of our podcast community, and we appreciate your continued support. Together, let's keep chasing our dreams and making a lasting impact in the world of sports.